Every pastor in that town died before 60, until one man found the journal they left behind. You don't come to a town like Dunslow by accident. It's the kind of place tucked so far into the hills, you wouldn't find it unless you meant to. One road in, one road out, framed by dying pine and silence thick enough to suffocate memory. There are no billboards, no gas stations, just a rusted iron sign that creaks in the wind. Dunslow, Pop, 1238. And a church, sitting at the town's highest point like an old crown that no one's dared polish in years. I wasn't looking for God when I came here. I wasn't even looking for purpose. Truthfully, I was looking to disappear. To let the world forget my name while I remembered how to breathe. The bishop had offered me the post like it was some favor. Quiet place. Peaceful. The last pastor passed suddenly. Good people. Old church. You'll have space to think. He never mentioned that every pastor in Dunslow for the past 6 generations had died before turning 60. No one told me that part. The house they gave me sat just behind the church. A small, weather-beaten structure with chipping white paint and shutters that screamed when touched by the wind. The key barely turned in the lock. Dust greeted me like an old acquaintance, floating in golden shafts of light that cut through cracked windows. But it was the church itself, St. Lillian's, that drew me in. Stone-built, steepled, ivy-choked. Its bell tower stood like a finger pointing upward, though the bell inside hadn't rung in years. Locals said it cracked during a storm in '87 and was never replaced. I'd come early to settle in before my first Sunday sermon, and still no one came to greet me. No welcome committee, no curious neighbors. Just silence, and the occasional flicker of curtain from across the road. But I noticed something else almost immediately. Whenever someone did walk by, an old man pulling a cart, a teenager on a rusty bike, they slowed near the church. Not to look, not to admire, but to glance, subtly, with the same instinct people have when walking past a fresh grave. And then they'd quicken their pace. That night, I walked the grounds alone. The graveyard was behind the chapel, laid out in a rough U-shape, stones leaning like drunks at a bar. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry soil. I passed rows of names I didn't know, until one set caught my eye. All on the same row, spaced a few yards apart. All of them. Pastors. Reverend Charles Hennings, 1941-1968, Rev. Thomas Avery, 1969-1986, Reverend Micah Sloan. 4. Reverend Daniel Blythe, 2005-2020, Reverend Ronald Mallory, 2020-2022. I stopped cold. The pattern hit like a whispered threat. Every one of them served no longer than 15 to 20 years, and none of them lived past 60. The last one, Mallory, barely 2 years. There were no flowers, no memorials, just short epitaphs carved in worn stone. He served, he led, he's gone. The next morning, I climbed the narrow stairwell into the church's main hall. Dust blanketed every pew. The air smelled like old hymnals and colder things. Wood rot, maybe. There was a faint, lingering sweetness, the kind that shouldn't be there, the kind that came from closed spaces left untouched. I walked up to the pulpit, ran my hand along its edge. It was worn smooth, grooved by years of fingers gripping during sermons and funerals. Behind me, the stained glass window let in fractured light, blues and reds, pouring over empty seats like spilled paint. But one shaft of gold cut through and landed, oddly enough, on the very last pew, the one farthest from the altar. That pew was different, older, darker in tone. Its cushion, while covered in the same maroon velvet, was threadbare and slightly indented, as if someone had sat there longer and more often than anywhere else. I stepped closer, curious. That's when I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible, like wood dragging gently over stone. I froze. The building had been silent for over an hour. I was alone. I turned. Nothing moved. I crouched, reached down, ran my fingers along the floor, smooth, until my hand passed over a faint groove in the wood, only inches from the leg of the last pew, like something heavy had been pulled, not recently, but not long ago either. I stood again, uneasy. Later that evening, I sat in the parsonage kitchen, going over some of Mallory's old notes left in a folder labeled funeral readings. His handwriting was steady, formal, but on the last page, near the margin, he'd scribbled something in smaller, tighter strokes. The chair moves when no one's there. I stopped looking back. I don't want to know what's sitting there anymore. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I laid awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house was deep, too deep. No traffic, no wind, just my own breath and the occasional, settling creak of wood. At 3:17 a.m., I heard it again, that dragging sound, this time louder, closer. I rose slowly, heartbeat steady but rising. I opened the bedroom door. Nothing. I crept through the hallway into the main room. Stillness. Then again, a faint scrape from the direction of the church. I didn't go outside, not that night, but I stood at the window and watched. The church stood under the pale wash of moonlight, unmoving. But through the stained glass window, I saw it, the faintest flicker, a shift of shadow, as if something had adjusted. The next morning, I opened the church just after dawn. The pews waited in solemn silence. I walked down the center aisle, the dust swirling in soft golden spirals around my steps. And then I stopped. The last pew was no longer aligned with the rest. It was turned, ever so slightly, toward the pulpit, as if something had sat there and was now watching me preach. The morning light made everything look harmless. The church stood bathed in soft gold, and the parsonage felt almost domestic with the smell of toast and coffee drifting lazily through the small kitchen. For a moment, I allowed myself the lie that everything last night had been a dream, that the pew had always been slightly turned, that wood contracts and shifts with age. But the truth always leaks in, slowly, then all at once. I walked back to the church with a broom in hand, pretending that dusting was the reason. But I wasn't thinking about cobwebs or hymnals. I was thinking about that last pew and the weight I felt in the air, like something left unsaid was thickening around me. Inside, everything was still. The pew was back in its place. I stopped at the altar, glanced toward the lectern where Pastor Mallory used to stand, and something caught my eye. A faint shimmer of light refracted from the far window. I stepped down from the dais and walked slowly to the east side of the church. There, in the old reading room, one of the stained glass windows had a crack running down its center, so fine it was nearly invisible unless the sun hit it just right. I moved closer. The crack didn't run in a natural arc. It split in a jagged vertical line, almost like it had been struck, not from the outside, but from within. The surrounding glass held delicate depictions of saints and lilies, now fractured, the painted eyes warped. I reached out and touched it. The glass felt warm, not from the sun, but from something else, as if the memory of the impact still lingered. The reading room was where Mallory spent most of his time, or so the townspeople told me. He'd rewritten every sermon by hand, in pencil, in this room, long after computers had been installed. He never trusted machines. Some things should stay analog, one woman had said, shaking her head and smiling with something between admiration and sadness. I sat at his old desk, now half covered in loose pages and yellowing tracks. The chair groaned under me. There was an impression in the wood where his forearms must have rested, the grain worn smooth by years of pressure. As I ran my hand across the surface, my fingers caught a faint indentation, tiny lines in the shape of an X. It looked almost accidental, like someone had absently carved it over and over. But the more I looked, the more I noticed. There were 3 of them, all identical, all carefully aligned. Why carve an X, and why 3? I glanced toward the cracked window again, then down at the drawer below. It was locked. Not with a keyhole, just stuck, swollen with time. I tugged once, twice, and it slid open with a reluctant groan. Inside were only a few things: a small cloth-bound Bible with worn corners, a rusted fountain pen, and a single sheet of paper folded tightly into a square. I opened it slowly. The handwriting was Mallory's, tight, clipped, but not a sermon, a note. I tried to avoid the pattern, but it knows. I skipped the dates, I broke the rhythm, but something came anyway. Don't touch the well. There was no signature, just those 3 lines. I read them again and again. The well, I'd walked the church grounds. I didn't remember seeing a well. I pocketed the note and stepped outside, the sun now climbing higher, casting long shadows behind the chapel. I circled the perimeter, scanning the dry grass and the ancient oaks that loomed like sentinels. Behind the back edge of the graveyard, nearly hidden beneath a tangle of vine and rotted fence post, I found it. A circular stone lip, maybe 3 feet high, cracked, covered in moss. The interior was sealed with a rusted grate chained across like a prison. It looked older than the church itself. There was no plaque, no warning, just a forgotten hole in the earth. I stood there for a long time. The wind shifted, and for a moment I thought I heard something, a whisper, or a breath rising from the stone. But it passed, and I told myself it was leaves, just leaves. That night, I returned to the reading room and sat in silence. The cracked window glowed faintly in the moonlight. The X marks in the desk almost pulsed under my fingers. I began to write, not a sermon, not a prayer, but a record. In a notebook of my own, I began. Second day, found the window, found the well. Something is not right here. I paused, pen hovering, and glanced at the note again. It knows. I didn't know what it was, but I did know this. Mallory didn't die from a stroke. Not if his final note said what it said, and not if the town had been burying pastors like clockwork for generations. Still, I told no one. Not yet. Because what good is warning anyone when no one wants to believe? And that night, I dreamt for the first time. I was standing at the pulpit, speaking to an empty church. The wind outside howled like a choir. I looked up, and there he was, in the last pew, not moving, not breathing, but watching. There are moments when the world opens just wide enough to let you glimpse something ancient, older than memory, older than reason. I didn't know it at the time, but the moment I found the journal, I was already past the point of return. It started with a storm. Dunslow doesn't get the kind of storms that crash through the heavens with lightning and fury. No, this one came like a slow confession. Gray clouds that hung too low, a humidity that turned breath into weight. Rain didn't fall so much as it whispered down in steady murmurs. It was the kind of weather that makes wooden beams creak and paint blister along the corners of forgotten places. The roof of the church had leaked for years. Mallory had meant to fix it. I found the work order, unsigned and yellowing, pinned behind the fuse box. The attic crawl space, above the chapel, was barely tall enough to crouch in. I went up with a flashlight and a toolbox, hoping to patch the sagging beam above the apse window before the plaster caved. It was there, under the slanted eaves, where I saw it. One section of the wall, rough pine panels stained by time and mildew, had come slightly loose. The nail had rusted clean through, and the board lifted when I pulled gently. Behind it wasn't insulation, or wires, or dust. It was hollow. Inside, nestled between the studs, was a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. At first, I thought it might have been part of the structure, an old ledger maybe. But when I touched it, it gave with a soft crunch, like paper starved of air. I unwrapped it on the attic floor. A journal, leather-bound, buckled at the corners. It smelled of smoke and dried leaves. No name on the front, no label. Just a long crease across the spine, where fingers had opened it again and again. I opened to the first page. The ink was faded, the writing slanted and uneven. April 2nd, 1910, Pastor Langley. So it began. Each page thereafter was a different hand, a different voice, like a passing of torches down through time, but instead of light, they passed along fear. Langley had written of a presence, first in the balcony, then in dreams. He watches, never closer than the back row, but each time I speak, he nods. The next entries were from Pastor Elmore in 1928, shorter, tighter. I skipped Sunday. I couldn't bear to look at the pew. It was empty, but it wasn't. A crow sat on the altar that morning. It didn't fly away when I came in. Then Pastor Hart, 1954. The window cracked last night. No wind, just pressure. I felt something move through the walls. And then Pastor Brenner, 1973. They said my predecessor drowned, but they didn't say he was found kneeling. Each voice more brittle than the last, as if the act of writing drained them, as if getting the words out only invited the thing closer. I turned the pages slowly, almost afraid the paper would flake into dust. Some pages were torn, others stained. One had a burn mark that curled its corner upward like a dried leaf. Then I reached the final set of pages. The handwriting was recent. Pastor Ronald Mallory. His entries were more chaotic. No dates, just fragments, jagged thoughts. He only comes after the first sermon in Lent. I tried closing the church for a month. It didn't matter. Every man before me, I found their names. They all tried to leave. None got past the county line. He waits for the one who doubts, the one who questions whether what he's preaching still holds power. I think I've lost mine. I saw him last night, reflected in the window behind me. But when I turned, nothing. He doesn't knock. He doesn't call. He just waits for the end of your voice. The final page, only half a sentence. If I write this down, maybe it'll be enough. Maybe someone else will know that. And then nothing. Just an ink blot. As if the pen had dropped mid-thought, or the hand had been taken. I sat there, legs numb beneath me, journal heavy in my lap. The air in the attic had shifted. It felt tighter, as if the walls were breathing, as if they just exhaled after holding something in for a very long time. I brought the journal downstairs, wrapped it again, and placed it in a drawer beneath my bed. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the voices, not as words, but as tones, as rhythms. The voices of pastors long gone, layered over one another like a dying choir, and underneath them all, something else. A breath that didn't match mine. I got up, lit a candle, and walked into the church barefoot. The pews stared back at me in silence, but the last one, furthest from the altar, held a weight in the shadows. I couldn't see him, but I knew. He had read the journal too. The snow came early that year. By the first week of November, Dunsloe had already vanished under a quiet white sheet that seemed too soft to be dangerous. But there was something unnerving about how the snowfall muffled everything. The birds, the roads, even time itself. The church looked beautiful beneath it. I remember standing in the parsonage doorway one morning, looking across the yard as flakes drifted down in slow spirals, coating the stone and wood in purity. And yet, I knew exactly what that snow was hiding. I had started rereading the journal, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to make sense of what was happening. Pastor Mallory's last few entries haunted me, not just for what they said, but for what they didn't. The gaps, the missing weeks, the fragmented sentences that stopped like a breath cut short. It was like watching someone walk into fog and never return. But I wasn't just looking at his words anymore. I was following his trail. I went to the county clerk's office on a freezing Tuesday. The building was barely heated, the files yellowed and brittle. The clerk older than the bricks. I asked for the death records of every pastor who had served St. Lillian's since its founding. The clerk gave me a strange look, but he didn't ask why. I took the files home in a thick manila envelope and read them at my kitchen table, one by one, as the kettle screamed behind me. None of them had died in the same way, but they had all died, quietly. Reverend Langley, heart failure. Reverend Elmore, fell from the bell tower. Reverend Hart, found frozen beside the old well. Reverend Brenner, apparent drowning. Reverend Avery, stroke during morning prayer. Reverend Mallory, sudden cardiac arrest, alone, in the sacristy. The details seemed unremarkable at first, all plausible, all explainable. But the pattern wasn't in how they died, it was when. Every single one died in the final weeks of fall, between October 20th and November 30th. Every one of them had reported strange behavior before their death. Missed sermons, scattered notes, isolated periods of silence. All had reported burnout, according to church council minutes. None had made it to Advent. And then I found something else. In the old vestry log, kept by the senior deacon, stored in the back of the archives, I found a repeating entry across the decades. Always written in different handwriting, but always the same phrase, Thanle Kuya, canceled by pastor's request. The midnight service, canceled every year, often with no explanation. One pastor had crossed it out entirely in red ink, scribbled, "Do not conduct," beside it. But I had never canceled it. I didn't even know it was coming. I flipped open the liturgical calendar on my desk. The midnight service, an ancient tradition observed by few, held on the final Sunday before Advent. It was less a sermon and more a vigil, a symbolic confrontation of darkness. The kind of service you didn't find in modern programs anymore. I circled the date, 2 weeks away. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear. Not yet. Resolve. I would not cancel it. That night, I returned to the church again, late, after midnight, when the roads were blanketed in ice and every breath outside turned to smoke. I walked the aisle in darkness, lit only by the stained glass moonlight and the flickering of the sanctuary lamp. The pews watched me again. Don't know how to describe it any other way. They weren't empty, not completely. They were waiting. I sat on the steps of the altar, journal in hand. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" And I swear to you, something creaked. Not from the ceiling, not from the walls, from the back row. I stood, turned, and walked the aisle slowly, my footsteps echoing. The pews loomed larger in the shadows, and when I reached the last one, I saw it again. The cushion was indented, and on the seat, resting precisely where someone's hand might rest, was a fresh black smudge. Charcoal? Dust? No. Ash. I reached out, touched it, still warm. I looked up, and in the reflection of the stained glass window, I saw a shape. A man. No details. Just a silhouette. Sitting. Watching. I turned, and nothing was there. Just silence. But I had seen him. The journal entries weren't fiction. The well wasn't forgotten. The midnight service wasn't an oversight. Every death had followed the same pattern, and I was the next link in the chain. The only question left now wasn't whether I'd survive. It was whether I'd be the first one to finish the journal. By the second week of November, my sleep had become thin and brittle, like old glass. I'd lie down exhausted, body heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. And yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Not at first. At first, it was just the church, always the same dream. I'd find myself standing at the pulpit under a cold gray light. The sanctuary would be empty, rows of pews stretching into shadow. No parishioners, no voices, just the echo of wind against stained glass. And then, every time, I'd look up, and he'd be there, seated at the very back, last pew, always in the exact same place, never moving, never blinking. a tall silhouette, hunched slightly forward, like he was listening. But his face, God help me, his face was never visible. It was always obscured, like the shadows didn't just fall on him. They clung to him, thick and unmoving. I could never make out his features, but I could feel them, watching me. The first few nights, I tried to dismiss it. Stress, isolation, the weight of too much history on too few shoulders. But dreams don't leave marks. And on the fourth night, I woke up with a bruise on my forearm in the shape of a fingerprint. I hadn't moved from bed. No doors had opened. No alarms had gone off. Just that single, perfect bruise. After that, I stopped sleeping in my room. I moved a cot into the church, told myself it was for Advent preparation. The lie didn't convince anyone, not even me. The journal stayed beside me, tucked under my coat like a relic. I read the entries aloud now, sometimes in the sanctuary after dark, just to see if anything changed. My voice would echo off the stone and return to me warped, like it had passed through something unseen on its way back. One night, while I read aloud a passage from Pastor Hart's 1954 entry, "He no longer waits in the pew," I saw him beside the altar. The candle beside me flickered violently and went out. Not a draft, not a breeze. It was as though the flame had been snuffed by fingers I couldn't see. I didn't move. I sat in the dark and waited. And slowly, ever so slowly, I began to hear something. Breathing, not mine. Ragged, measured, like the lungs of a man who hadn't spoken aloud in decades. It came from the far end of the chapel, from the pew. I whispered, "What are you?" Silence. Then, one creak, the sound of weight shifting. I turned the flashlight toward the back, but it flickered and died in my hand. Nothing, again, but everything. The next morning, I went to town. I needed answers. I visited the oldest living member of the congregation, Agnes Holloway, 92, sharp as frost. Her house smelled like lavender and mothballs, and her eyes were too tired to lie. I asked her plainly, "Do you know about the midnight service?" She didn't look surprised. She nodded, slowly. Then she said something I'll never forget. "We don't talk about the pew." I waited. She sipped her tea, hands trembling. It started with Langley. They said he lost his mind, preached to shadows. Then it happened again and again. All of them started seeing him. The man at the back. I saw him once, you know. I was 12. I'd snuck into the church during a storm. There was no one inside, but I saw the pew rocking, slowly, back and forth. She closed her eyes. I never went back after dark again. I asked her if anyone had ever tried to stay, to break the pattern. She looked at me then, really looked, and her voice turned into a whisper. "One did." I leaned forward. "Who?" She paused. "Pastor Doyle, 1932. He wrote things in the hymnals. They burned them, said it was blasphemy. But some people say he found a way to push the man back." "What happened to him?" I asked. She exhaled. "He disappeared. Gone. No death certificate. No grave. Just a man erased." That night, I returned to the church with new resolve. I took down the old hymnal from the back shelf, opened the pages, flipped slowly past the psalms and praises. And there, in the spine of page 316, written in red pencil, nearly illegible. He waits for the voice to crack, for the certainty to fade. As long as you speak with conviction, he cannot rise. I read it 3 times. Conviction, that's what protected us. Not salt, not symbols, but certainty. I laughed, quiet and bitter. What a terrible irony. The longer a pastor preaches, the more cracks he hides, the more doubt creeps in, the more the man in the pew begins to lean forward. And that was when I realized something else. The last 4 sermons I had given, I hadn't believed a word. I had 1 week left, 7 days until the midnight service, 7 days until the final Sunday before Advent, 7 days to either finish the journal or join its pages. The church had grown colder, not in temperature, but in presence. The air itself felt heavier now, like something unseen had sunk into the walls. Every board I stepped on groaned a little louder. Every door I opened creaked a little longer. The sanctuary's stillness had changed. It no longer waited. It anticipated. The dreams continued, but they no longer started in the pulpit. They started in the pews, my body stiff, unable to move, while the man in the last row stood and walked toward me, each step falling without sound. He never reached me. I always woke up in the moment he raised his hand. I stopped sleeping altogether. Instead, I read. I read every word in the journal again, slowly, desperately, searching for anything the others might have missed. Some entries hinted at rituals, others at faith, but most ended the same way, with uncertainty, with sentences that trailed into nothing. And I began to wonder if that's exactly what he waited for: the loss of language, the collapse of belief. On the 6th night, I stood once more at the back of the church and faced the pew. The candlelight didn't reach that far anymore. The shadows had grown thicker than fire could push back. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. I whispered into the dark, "I know what you are." Silence. "I know why they died. It wasn't you." Stillness. It was silence. It was fear. It was what they didn't say, what they didn't finish. Then I opened the journal to the final page, Mallory's last entry. If I write this down, maybe it'll be enough. Maybe someone else will know that. And for the first time in weeks, I picked up my pen. I finished his sentence. "You are not stronger than the truth." Then I turned the page and wrote my own. "I will preach the midnight service. I will name you. I will not stop speaking. Even if my voice fails, the words will remain." The next morning, I called for a service. No one came. I expected that. The town was quiet that Sunday. A light snow had begun to fall again, as if the sky itself wanted to muffle whatever was about to happen. I stood alone in the pulpit, lit only by the single oil lamp I'd placed on the altar. The pews in front of me were empty, all except one, the last pew, and in it, him. For the first time, I saw his outline clearly. A tall figure, coat draped across narrow shoulders, head bowed, hands clasped in his lap. He looked like any man you'd pass on the street. But the longer you looked, the more wrong it became. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He wasn't waiting. He was remembering. I began to speak. Not a sermon, not a scripture, but a story. I told the story of Langley, of Elmore, of Brenner. I told the story of Mallory. I named their fears aloud. I named his presence aloud. I read their words, their fragments. I spoke for those who hadn't finished speaking. And the moment I said the words, he waits for the voice to crack. The lamp on the altar flickered. But it didn't go out. The shadows didn't move closer. The figure in the back didn't rise. Because I didn't stop. I preached until the sun rose, until the last candle burned itself dry. And when I finally lowered my voice, when I whispered the last line, "He is not stronger than the truth," I looked back. The last pew was empty, truly, completely empty, not just of presence, but of weight, as if something had finally let go, as if something had been waiting not to be defeated, but to be heard. That afternoon, I placed the journal back in the wall, not because I was afraid, but because someone else might need it one day. But this time, I left a final page tucked inside the front cover, a page in my own hand. If you are reading this, speak. Don't let the silence grow louder than your conviction. The man in the pew is real, but so is your voice. Don't let him finish the sentence you were meant to write. And to this day, the midnight service continues at St. Lillian's every year, with candles lit and a voice that does not crack.